What if I told you that one of England's queens never ruled, never chose her fate, and never even learned to write her husband's name before he disappeared forever? What if the English throne was once bound to the hands of a little girl whose childhood was traded for peace, and whose tears were written off as diplomacy? She was married before she lost her baby teeth, widowed before she could read, offered to the son of the man who took her crown, and what she said next shocked her kingdoms. Why did a 9-year-old defy a king in public? What horrifying truth did she discover after her husband's fall? And what final decision did she make? One that made even her enemies call her dangerous. This is the story England tried to forget. A tale of royal lies, betrayal, political puppetry, and a voice too small to be heard yet too powerful to be erased. Stay until the end, because the most haunting part of Isabella's story is how it ended. In a grand cathedral scented with incense and layered in echoes, a procession halted as a figure emerged barely tall enough to see over the folds of velvet she wore. She did not walk as much as she was guided, her small feet disappearing beneath the hem of a royal gown stitched with symbols she couldn't yet read. The weight of gold embroidery dragged behind her like an anchor through time. At the altar stood her future, waiting. Isabella was 6 years old. The crown placed beside her was not sized for a child. It gleamed with the cold authority of empire, cast in precious metals, its jewels flashing under candlelight like frozen tears. The man she was promised to, King Richard of England, stood nearly 5 times her age, his expression composed, the curve of his lips uncertain between duty and discomfort. He had already known love once, and lost it. Now, in the name of peace, he had returned to the altar, not for romance, not for companionship, but for an alliance. Around them, nobles looked on not with joy, but calculation. From high among the arches of the cathedral, light filtered in narrow beams through stained glass saints and apostles. The colors danced on the stone floor in patterns of silent witness. They illuminated the child as she repeated phrases in a foreign tongue, words fed to her like fragments of a spell she barely understood. A French princess marrying the King of England. It was an act of statecraft, not affection. Her name had already been inked into treaties long before she could write it herself. She was not there as a person. She was there as a promise. As she fumbled through her lines, one of the golden lions embroidered on the king's robe caught her attention. She reached out to touch it mid-vow, fascinated, unaware of what was being sealed around her. Some among the audience smiled at the innocence. Others frowned at the impropriety, but none intervened. The ceremony continued. A crown was not placed on her head that day. Not fully. Not yet. The symbol of her new identity rested beside her, heavy and waiting. For now, she was a queen in name alone, a title without power, a role without understanding. But history had taken note. From the shores of Calais to the towers of Westminster, the bells would ring out that a marriage had been forged, a union meant to quiet decades of bloodshed between England and France, and it had been signed with the hand of a child still learning her letters. What the chronicles would not capture, not in ink, not in praise or protest, was how that child barely reached the banquet table at her own celebration, how she fell asleep to music written for kings, her head resting against the man who would shape the rest of her short life, or how, in the silence between speeches, her mother wept behind a veil, out of sight, but not unheard. Isabella had been born into crisis, not personal, not yet, but political, the kind that reshapes borders and decides who rules whom, who lives in comfort, and who is offered up like a sacrificial dove. Her father, Charles of France, would in time be known as Charles the Mad, a ruler who believed his body was made of glass and sometimes forgot his own name. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was already navigating the courts like a seasoned tactician, having married at 14 to a stranger who spoke no German. So when Isabella was born into the blood-soaked 1390s, her destiny was not open to question. Her life was drafted, not lived. From the beginning, she was not a girl. She was a solution. The 100 years of war between France and England had not ended. They had merely paused, with truces and bargains and betrayals punctuating the quiet between battles. By the time Isabella could walk, thousands had already died in conflicts her marriage was supposed to resolve. It was not an uncommon thought in those courts that a little girl, wrapped in silk, branded with lineage, sent across the sea, might prevent another 1,000. They dressed her in blue velvet for the occasion. It was too large, and the jewels stitched into the fabric pressed against her shoulders like the weight of unch sorrow. Her attendants tried to fix the folds with hidden pins. They failed. She didn't complain. She smiled. No one asked what she understood. They merely pointed her toward the altar. Later, they would call it a success, a stunning moment of diplomacy, the beginning of peace. But when she returned to her chambers that evening, her nursemaid removed the velvet gown and found that it had left red marks along the child's skin, raised, raw impressions, not from violence, but from formality. She rubbed them gently as Isabella yawned and asked whether she could keep the pony that had been gifted to her that day. The answer was yes. The pony's name was Blanche. It would be one of the few things she'd get to call her own. The weeks that followed were filled with pageantry, but underneath the pomp was the quiet, unrelenting process of transformation. What had been a child with a name was now becoming a figure with a purpose. Her toys were boxed and replaced with etiquette manuals. Her nursery slowly filled with women who didn't sing lullabies, but instead taught her how to bow to kings. She was instructed to sit still 4 hours while seamstresses measured her 4 gowns she would wear not for play, but for performance. Garments so rich they weighed nearly as much as she did, and every fitting, every stitch, every new word in English taught by court tutors served as a brick in the wall being built between her and everything she had known. The French court watched her change, some with pride, others with pity. Her mother, Isabeau, drifted between both emotions. She would hold Isabella's hand during fittings and try not to cry, but she never questioned the necessity of any of it. After all, Sheeta had once been that girl in silk, prepared and packaged, shipped like an offering. The difference was, Isabella was younger, and the world seemed colder. Autumn came, and the preparations quickened. The day of departure drew near. The English envoys had arrived, their presence a daily reminder that this was no fairy tale. When the procession finally began to escort Isabella toward the coast, it moved like a river of ceremony and sadness. There were horses draped in banners, trumpeters heralding each stage of the journey, and nobles ensuring everything was recorded for posterity. But none of it could hide the simple truth. A 6-year-old was being handed over to another nation in a page in a contract. The child sat in a litter designed especially for her, a movable throne, cushioned and enclosed, with painted panels showing romantic scenes. But the pictures meant little to her. She was more interested in the basket of dolls they let her keep at her side. She named each one after her sisters. Peasants lined the roads to watch the caravan pass. Some waved, others crossed themselves. The stories about the little princess had traveled ahead of her. They said she was brave. They said she was being noble. What they didn't say was that she was still losing everything she had ever known. At night, they stayed in castles along the way. In everyone, the rooms were too big, the ceilings too high, the voices too formal. Isabella missed the sound of her nurse singing. She missed the smell of the kitchens back home. But she smiled when people greeted her. She bowed when she was told. She whispered her new English phrases to herself as she fell asleep. Finally, they reached the coastline. The wind was sharp. The sea smelled unfamiliar. But the English court had prepared a reception on the opposite shore. Pavilions were being built near Calais. Banners rose over the dunes. And Richard, the man she had married in ceremony, was there, waiting again. She would meet him in person for the first time. It was said that Richard had tried to be thoughtful. He had ordered that a pony be presented to her, along with a tiny crown, a doll-sized scepter, and a velvet cloak lined with fur. When Isabella was led into the great tent where he waited, she hesitated. He was tall, he was dressed in gold, and his voice was softer than she expected. He knelt before her, holding out the pony's reins. The pony was white, with a blue ribbon braided into its mane. Her name was Blanche, 2. Isabella did not speak. She clung to her governess' skirts and stared. The adults called the meeting a success, but when the formalities ended, and the gifts had been catalogued, and the banners lowered, Isabella sat alone in her temporary quarters, stroking the pony's mane and whispering to her dolls that she wanted to go home. Home was no longer hers. The sea waited, and across it, a foreign crown, a foreign court, and the next chapter of a childhood already vanishing behind her. The crossing was made under a grey sky. The sea rose in soft swells, not angry, but vast, indifferent to the passengers it carried. Isabella stood near the railing of the ship, wrapped in furs too large for her frame, watching the coastline of France disappear into the mist. Behind her, chests of clothing and gifts were secured with ropes. Somewhere below deck, Blanche the pony neighed anxiously, sensing the movement of the vessel. She said nothing, just watched. When England came into view, it did not look like a place from a storybook. There were no castles rising from the clouds. The shoreline was jagged, the hills dark. It looked solid, cold, final. The English nobles who greeted her at the port bowed low, but there was no warmth in their expressions. She was received not as a child, but as a possession to be accounted for. An official ledger was produced and read aloud, confirming the arrival of the Princess of France, now Queen Consort of England. Her name was pronounced with care, not affection, but precision. From there, the journey inland began. At each stop, townsfolk came to glimpse the young queen. Children her age pointed at her from behind their mothers. Some threw petals, others simply stared. She smiled at them all, because it was what she had been taught. Her smile was already becoming a skill. Windsor Castle became her new home. Its corridors echoed differently. The air smelled of cold stone and old smoke, and though servants bowed and curtsied, few spoke French. Her attendants translated, but the silence between words became her constant companion. Richard had arranged for a separate household to be established for her within the castle walls. It was an act of generosity, meant to preserve her comfort. The rooms were filled with books in French, toys from her homeland, and tapestries that reminded her of home. But still, it was not France. It was a cage lined with velvet. Her days settled into routine. Lessons in reading and writing, English phrases repeated over and over, meals taken with formality, walks in the garden, always accompanied, nights filled with stories told in half-comprehended language. She rarely saw Richard. When he did visit, he brought her gifts, books with golden illustrations, a mechanical bird that chirped when wound, sweets wrapped in lace. He would sit beside her and ask questions in a voice both kind and distant. She answered as best she could. Sometimes she sang for him French nursery songs he didn't understand but seemed to enjoy. She began to write her name, Isabella, Queen of England. The letters were awkward, the curves unsure, but she practiced, determined to learn what was expected of her. The court spoke of her fondly, a clever child, well-behaved, sweet-tempered, but always a child, never a queen. And beneath it all, unnoticed by most, Isabella grew quieter. The nights were the hardest. She would lie in her bed beneath a canopy of silk and whisper to her dolls about home, about her sisters, about the scent of lavender from the gardens of the French court. And always, she asked the same question: when can I see my mother again? No one had the heart to answer. Each morning brought routine. Rise at dawn, dress with the help of ladies in waiting, who spoke softly in a language she was still learning. A prayer whispered in Latin she didn't yet understand. Then lessons, reading, arithmetic, heraldry, protocol. A child's education disguised beneath the robes of diplomacy. Her tutors corrected her posture more than her grammar. She was not meant to speak as much as she was meant to reflect composure. In the afternoons, there were brief windows of reprieve. Walks through the castle gardens, the gravel paths edged with manicured hedges. She would talk to the birds and recite rhymes under her breath. Sometimes Blanche, her pony, was brought out for her to ride, a creature as foreign in this place as she was. They seemed to understand each other, yet always, the day ended with obligation. Formal dinners she did not enjoy. Ceremonies she did not grasp. Processions through halls where everyone bowed to a girl who still asked for bedtime stories. Sometimes she was told to wave. Other times, simply to be still. No one expected her to rule, but they needed her to symbolize something, the fragile hope of peace. The union of two kingdoms fraying at the edges. The English nobility watched her with mixed expressions. Some saw her as charming, others as an unwelcome emblem of a French alliance they resented. She was too young to understand politics, but not too young to feel the change in air when certain lords entered the room. Not too young to notice when whispers stopped as she passed. In this unfamiliar world, Lady Ducie became her anchor, a noble woman from France assigned to her care. Ducie carried the weight of home in her voice. She told her stories at night, fairy tales filled with rivers and queens who sang to the moon. She corrected her English gently, tucked her in, and answered questions that had no gentle answers. Why do they bow to me? Because they must, Ducie would say. But not all who bow believe. Will Papa visit? Not soon. Will Mama write? She already has. The letters came irregularly, filtered through layers of court approval. Some arrived months late. Isabella read them with trembling fingers. Her mother's words were always formal, even in affection. And between the lines, the girl could sense the reality. She had become something distant, not lost, but far away in every sense. And yet, she tried. She practiced English before the mirror, mimicking the ladies of court. She rehearsed smiles for occasions she didn't yet understand, and she took great care when she signed her name. Each letter formed with deliberate intent, as if writing it correctly might bring clarity to the role she was trying to play. The court began to refer to her more in documents than in conversation. Her Grace, the Queen, the Consort, a child spoken of like a statue. Meanwhile, beyond the castle walls, England trembled. Richard's position grew less stable with each passing month. His courtly refinements, his patronage of the arts, his soft voice, they clashed with the rising frustrations of his barons. Taxation, favoritism, rumors of indulgence, tensions simmered in corners Isabella would never see, but she felt it all the same. In the change of tone when his name was spoken, in the increasing absence of music at court, in the way her own attendants were instructed to behave more cautiously, to speak less openly. She asked Ducie one evening, "Is the king afraid?" Ducie paused, then answered, "The king is a man, and all men are afraid when others stop listening." That night, Isabella dreamt of birds trapped in cages made of glass. One of them sang until it cracked its voice. No one heard. She woke before dawn and sat alone by the window, the grey English sky pressing low, a secret waiting to break. And still, the court moved on. For appearances, for tradition, for control. They dressed her in pearls and sent her into rooms where the air was colder than stone. No longer a guest, not yet a queen, just a girl asked to wear a future not made for her. Then, as summer turned its edge toward autumn, everything began to shift. It started with whispers, quiet at first, then louder. Names she had heard only in passing now seemed to hang like storm clouds over every hallway. Henry Bolingbroke. The name carried weight she didn't yet understand, but others did. Servants spoke more carefully. Doors that had once remained open were now shut. Men who had always bowed began to glance at one another instead. She saw Richard less often. When he came, he was distracted. His eyes moved quickly, scanning rooms as though seeking threats behind tapestries. He would sit beside her, ask how her studies were going, then fall silent halfway through her answer. Once, she handed him a drawing she had made, a sketch of Windsor's garden with the pony grazing under an apple tree. He smiled without seeing it. That was the last time she saw him truly smile. In July of 1399, Richard left Windsor. He said he was going on a journey, that he would return soon. He knelt beside her, took her hands in his, and said that she should be brave and good, and remember everything he had taught her. She asked if she could come with him. He touched her cheek. "Not this time," he whispered. She watched his procession leave through the castle gates, unaware it was not a journey, but an escape. or an attempt to preserve what power he still held. He rode out to confront Bolingbroke's rising rebellion, but the kingdom he ruled had shifted beneath him. Allies fell away, nobles abandoned his cause. Even the very stones of England seemed to lean toward a different voice. Weeks passed. Each day, Isabella asked if there was news. Some days she received soft denials, other days, silence. Then came the day Ducie entered her room and sat beside her bed. "The king has been taken. Taken." The word rang out in a small room, a bell cracked in half. She did not cry. She simply asked, "Does that mean he's gone?" Ducie did not answer. The court around her changed overnight. New faces appeared. Old faces vanished. English voices became more clipped, more formal. The pages who once bowed with warmth now bowed without looking at her. The name Bolingbroke became law. Richard was deposed in Parliament, declared unfit, unworthy. And Isabella, Queen of England by name, was suddenly something without category. Too young to be a widow, too foreign to be English, too royal to be ignored. Ducie tried to explain what had happened in words that wouldn't hurt, but no language could make sense of it. "They say he isn't king anymore," Isabella said one evening, her eyes fixed on the empty chair at the far end of her room. "Does that mean I'm not queen?" Ducie knelt beside her. "It means the world has changed again. Can I go home now?" Ducie didn't speak. She simply kissed the child's hand and tucked the blanket around her shoulders. In the following weeks, Isabella began to fade. She stopped asking for lessons, refused to attend the formal dinners, wore only black, even when told not to. She spent hours by the window with her doll in her lap, brushing its hair silently. Then came the final blow. Richard, her husband, her protector, her king, had passed away. No proclamation echoed through the halls. No bells were tolled. The news arrived in a letter, sealed and secret. The official cause left vague. The details blurred. Only a few knew the truth. Ducie read it and wept. She waited 2 days before telling Isabella. The child listened without blinking, then stood up, walked to the small cabinet where she kept Richard's gifts, and opened it. Inside were books, a carved box of sweets, now turned to dust, and the portrait he had once given her, a miniature likeness of a man trying to smile. She held it in her hands for a long time. "I want to wear black always," she said. "You will," Ducie whispered. She refused food 4 days, refused light, refused to speak unless spoken to. But in her silence there was no tantrum, only stillness, as if some part of her had grown up overnight and sealed the door behind it. A child of 9, a bride no longer, a queen of nothing. The court didn't know what to do with her. Some said she should be returned to France. Others said she should stay, that she was too valuable, too symbolically potent. They debated her fate in halls she never entered, around tables she had once sat beside. And all the while, she sat in her small chamber at Windsor, stroking the mane of her doll, and asking no more questions. She already knew the answers. They were all the same. No, not now, not yet. Eventually, a decision was made. She would not go home, not yet. The new king, Henry IV, had inherited not only a crown, but a child queen who sat at the center of a diplomatic storm. Sending her back would be an admission of instability, a rupture in the appearance of continuity. Keeping her meant leverage, a tie to France, a bargaining chip, a quiet symbol of legitimacy in a reign built upon the ashes of another. So they gave her a new residence, a manor house set apart from court, neither prison nor palace, a strange limbo for a girl who no longer belonged to any world that understood her. There were attendants, meals, clothing, books, and silence. Always the silence. But it did not last long. One afternoon, Ducie entered her room, her face unreadable. A delegation was arriving, men in fine coats, speaking both English and French. There would be discussion, proposals, a new arrangement. They wanted Isabella to marry again. The proposal came not from France, but from within the very house that had dismantled her former life. Henry IV had a son, a boy of her age, young Henry. The plan, so carefully delivered, was simple. Marry the boy. Remain in England. Preserve peace. Ducie braced herself. She expected tears, panic, pleading. Instead, Isabella sat still. Then, with more clarity than she had ever shown, she asked a question no one expected. Is he the son of the man who took Richard's crown? Ducie hesitated. Yes. Isabella said nothing more that day. When the envoys returned the next morning, the child who greeted them was different. She stood taller, spoke firmly in French, and declared that she would not marry the son of her husband's usurper. Not now. Not ever. The room fell silent. It was a defiance no one had prepared for. A refusal not couched in childish whim or fear, but something stronger: principle, memory, loyalty. Though still years from adolescence, Isabella understood what the match meant. To accept it would be to erase Richard, to legitimize what had broken her world. She would not. Whispers moved swiftly through the court. Some called her obstinate, others brave, but among the most powerful, the question now became what to do with a girl who would not comply. Henry IV, already battling rebellions and dissent, saw the risk. Forcing her would look cruel. Allowing her refusal made him appear weak. He stalled, and in the meantime, Isabella made herself impossible to ignore. She dressed in mourning still, refused to speak English, rejected meals prepared by English cooks, attended church with her French retinue, and asked priests to pray for Richard's soul aloud. Every gesture, every word, every glance, quiet acts of rebellion. The house assigned to her became a miniature court of its own. Her French attendants continued to treat her as queen. They knelt, they bowed, they called her Your Grace. She received them in a carved chair under a canopy. She issued minor orders, distributed alms, practiced the rites of a role she technically no longer held. It was not delusion, it was control, the only control left to her. She wrote letters to France, to her mother, to her father, to the court she had not seen in 3 years. Letters filled with longing, but never despair. She did not beg to return. She made a case, pointed, diplomatic, measured. She was no longer asking. She was reminding them who she was. And finally, the tide began to turn. France, weary of the political insult her captivity implied, and bolstered by changing tides in its own fractured court, began to press for her return. The English, desperate for funds and peace at home, began to loosen their grip. Negotiations resumed, but nothing was simple. Isabella's dowry, her value, her status, all became points of bitter contention. France wanted everything returned. England wanted compensation, and in the middle, a girl turning 11, who had not asked for any of it. She waited, with patience, with quiet dignity, with a black ribbon tied around her wrist for the man she once called husband. And then, one morning, after years of absence and uncertainty, Ducie entered her chambers with news. You were going home. For the first time in months, Isabella smiled. It was not a child's smile. It was something older, something earned. She would not leave England as she had arrived, a doll in a velvet box, a symbol wrapped in innocence. She would leave as someone more dangerous, someone who had seen power stripped to its bones, someone who would not forget what had been taken and what she had chosen, in defiance, to protect. The journey back began in solemn grandeur. Isabella's departure was marked by a procession that mirrored her arrival: carriages, guards, banners, and ceremony. But everything felt heavier, not because of the trunks or tapestries or carefully counted coins accompanying her across the channel, but because of what she carried within. She was no longer the wide-eyed child who had arrived with dolls in her lap and stories in her head. Now, she traveled with silence. She left behind the rooms that had never become home, the halls where whispers replaced warmth, the faces that had studied her like a relic of foreign power. And though a few wept, her attendants, especially the English women who had come to admire her poise, Isabella did not cry. She bowed. She stepped into the carriage, and she did not look back. The road stretched out before her like a ribbon woven between two lives. Along the way, towns gathered to see her off, some out of respect, others out of curiosity. She wore mourning black still, a small silhouette beneath a velvet canopy, yet her posture never wavered. Those who expected a child found something far more haunting, a girl too composed for her age, whose eyes held centuries. At Dover, King Henry himself came to bid farewell. He spoke words of courtesy, of regret, of duty fulfilled. But Isabella did not soften. She curtsied, the motion precise, exact, and accepted his parting gifts with a voice like glass, delicate but unyielding. As the ship pulled away from the English coast, she stood at the stern, staring until the white cliffs vanished behind sea mist. In her hands, she held the same miniature portrait of Richard she had kept hidden for years. She had arrived a bride. She returned a widow. France, too, had changed in her absence. At the coast, nobles waited with measured joy. The reunion was more political than personal. They greeted her with fanfare, embraced her with protocol. But Isabella, now fluent in diplomacy, accepted every gesture with gratitude and distance. It was only when she saw her younger siblings, children who had barely been able to speak when she had left, that something broke in her expression. They ran toward her with awkward smiles, unsure whether to hug or bow. She opened her arms, and for a moment, she was simply their sister again. The return to Paris was a procession of pride. Banners rose, church bells rang, towns spilled into streets to catch a glimpse of the girl queen who had lived through England's shadows. But Isabella, cloaked in black, did not smile. At court, her mother wept at the sight of her. Her father, caught in one of his rare lucid spells, touched her cheek and called her by the name he had once whispered into her cradle. But she no longer belonged there either. The French courtiers found her unnerving, polite, yes, beautiful, certainly, but too solemn, too measured. When they expected tears, she offered cool words. When they expected childish laughter, she responded with silence. She had learned dignity in captivity, and she would not give it up. She kept to herself at first, writing, walking, praying. Her quarters were quiet, the windows often open, as if she still needed to feel the English wind to remind herself she had survived it. But she was watched. There were plans already forming. She was 12 now, a marriageable age in the eyes of medieval politics. Her status as former Queen of England made her a jewel in the crown of any future alliance. The talk had already begun, but Isabella was no longer an easy piece to place on the board. For the first time, she was aware of her worth, of her history, of her voice, and though she did not speak often, when she did, the room listened. She would not be sent away again without terms. She would not become a symbol without meaning. This time, she would choose, and the girl who had once been led by the hand down an old Tudor crown, too young to know the weight, now stood at the threshold of her future, prepared to carry it her own way. For nearly 2 years, Isabella refused every proposal. Some offers were subtle veiled inquiries from noble houses, hints at alliances wrapped in gifts and poetry. Others were bolder, pressed by her uncles with arguments of strategy and legacy. But each time, Isabella met them with a calm refusal that frustrated even the most seasoned diplomats. She took no joy in opposition, but she knew what it meant to be given away. So she built a quiet kingdom of her own. Her household at Valois became a sanctuary. There were gardens she tended herself, books she read without instruction, music she played not for performance, but for peace. She learned how to negotiate, how to write letters that said everything and revealed nothing, how to smile without surrender. Courtiers called her devout. Some whispered she was preparing for a convent. Perhaps she was, or perhaps she was simply buying time, the one luxury no one thought a teenage girl could demand. Her time of stillness ended with war. France had not found peace in her absence. A civil struggle between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians now tore the court into factions. Assassinations, betrayals, shifting allegiances. The world Isabella had returned to was unraveling, and in the middle stood a young man named Charles. Charles of Orleans, a prince by birth, a poet by inclination. At just 20, he had inherited not only a name, but a cause. His father, murdered in the streets of Paris, had left him the Armagnac mantle. He was now a cornerstone in France's power game. He needed strength, legitimacy, a wife, but this time, Isabella was not a pawn. She had met Charles once, briefly. He had bowed lower than the others, had spoken softly in her presence, had not mentioned Richard, and when the proposal came, formal, respectful, and direct, she did not answer right away. She asked to meet him again. Their second conversation lasted hours. He quoted poetry. She asked about war. He spoke of rebuilding France. She asked if he believed peace was possible. When he faltered, she smiled. Then she said yes. Their wedding was modest by royal standards. No trumpets, no foreign embassies, no painted ceilings or parades. Just a chapel, a handful of loyal witnesses, and to people who had seen too much to pretend at fairy tales. And yet, there was something hopeful in it. A rare thing. Isabella moved with Charles to his estates, and for the first time since childhood, she was not under guard, not a guest, not a hostage. She was home, and in that fragile window of peace, she became something she had never been allowed to be. A wife by choice, a mother, a woman who smiled not because she was taught to, but because she wanted to. The court still watched, the world still whispered, but for a little while, none of that mattered. She planted lavender, she wrote letters, she sang to her daughter, and she kept Richard's portrait in a drawer. No one touched her daughter's name was Jean. Born in the summer of 1409, she was small, strong-lunged, and fierce-eyed, and Isabella adored her with a depth that startled even herself. All the grief, the silence, the obedience Isabella had once wrapped around her own childhood, she unraveled for Jean. The child would know warmth, she would know safety, she would not be bartered for peace. Charles marveled at Isabella's calm. He wrote verses in her honor, odes that praised not just her grace, but her resolve, the quiet strength she carried like armor. Their court at Valois became a haven for poets, painters, and musicians, a gentle rebellion against the brutality outside its walls. Visitors remarked on the atmosphere, laughter at mealtimes, music in the corridors, books in every corner. It was a rare island of light in a kingdom tearing itself apart, and Isabella, at just 19, presided over it all with dignity beyond her years. She seemed untouchable, until the day she wasn't. It began softly, a mist dinner, a wave of nausea, a weariness that settled in her limbs like fog. Another child, the doctors said. Joy flared, but it was cautious. She was healthy. She was young. She had survived worse. Still, the months wore on with unease. Charles worried quietly. Her attendants prayed louder. Isabella remained composed. She walked in the gardens, read to Jean, wrote letters to her mother, and ignored the fear that flickered in candlelight each night when she was alone. On a grey September morning, the labor began. It lasted longer than the first. There were complications. The midwives whispered in corners. A priest was summoned, then dismissed. Hours passed. By nightfall, a second daughter was born. She did not cry, and Isabella, pale and trembling, asked to hold both her children at once. Wrapped in linen, she kissed each forehead, whispered names no one else heard, told them she loved them, told them to remember one another, told Charles, now kneeling at her side, that everything would be all right. She asked for Richard's portrait. She held it in one hand, her daughter's in the other, and then, her voice barely audible, she spoke her last words. All must be well. By morning, she was gone. The court did not believe it at first. How could she? Isabella the unbroken, Isabella the still, Isabella the queen of Poise be gone. The bells tolled at Valois for 3 days. Charles did not write for weeks. When he did, the poetry changed. It grew softer, slower, as if the language itself had lost something irreplaceable. The baby followed her mother within days. Jean, still too young to understand, was shielded from the news, but those who watched her said she looked to the windows more often after that, as if waiting for a voice that would not return. Isabella's funeral was quiet. She was buried not as the child queen of England, not as the daughter of Charles the Mad, but simply as Isabella of France, wife, mother, soul at rest. Her effigy showed a young woman, with eyes closed and hands gently folded. No crown, no scepter, just peace. It was the one thing she had never been given in life. Now it was hers. Time passed, but the silence Isabella left behind did not fade. In England, her name lingered in the corners of courtly memory, whispered by those who had once bowed to her, recited by clerks preserving the annals of Richard's reign. Chroniclers spoke of her as a child queen lost to politics, a symbol of a treaty that had withered. Some sought to soften the memory of Richard through her, framing his affection for her as kindness, as evidence of gentleness in a man many had vilified. In France, her story took on another hue. There, she was remembered for her defiance. Her refusal to marry again under pressure became legend, the quiet strength of a girl who had once bowed only to rise again. Courtiers described her not just as noble, but as principled. Daughters of nobility were told her story like a parable. That grace need not be silent, and even youth could carry the weight of will. But even these retellings, however romantic, miss something deeper. Isabella's life was not a fable. It was not a morality play. It was not a tragedy crafted for courtly literature. It was the testimony of what happens when childhood is replaced with ceremony, when love is negotiated, when duty wears a crown heavier than any child should bear. Modern historians began to see it more clearly. Through surviving letters, they traced her thoughts, poised and measured, yet pulsing with longing. Through inventories, they saw the transformation from girl to symbol. Toys replaced by jewels, rhymes replaced by prayer, soft fabrics exchanged for stiff brocade. One archivist wrote, "She was not forgotten, she was misremembered." Indeed, Isabella was not merely a chapter in someone else's story, not just Richard's queen, not just Charles' wife. She was a person lost in the space between power and obedience, between borders and vows, between girlhood and grief. Her portrait was once hung in the halls of Blois, not in the throne room, but in the library, not draped in gold, but in a plain blue gown, her hair uncovered, her eyes fixed just beyond the viewer, as if searching for something never found. Jean grew older, and would carry her mother's strength quietly. She was married, but not bartered. She was raised by a father who had known tenderness and loss, and by the memory of a woman who had defied an empire by simply saying no. Today, Isabella's legacy endures not in monuments, but in questions. How do we protect the vulnerable when power sees them only as tools? How do we remember those who never chose their fate, yet bore it with dignity? And what does it mean to survive history, not in triumph, but in truth? Isabella of France lived just 19 years, but in those years, she became more than a queen. She became a witness, a daughter, a wife, a mother, a symbol, a survivor, and in her final breath, when she said, "All must be well," she gave the world not resignation, but grace. May we remember her not for the crown she wore, but for the silence she refused to let define her.